Welcome back to Z-Speed and thanks for tuning back in. Today we'll be installing this MAPerformance High Flow catted downpipe on our 10th Gen Civic SI. So if you're interested in a step-by-step guide on how to install one of these on your Civic, then you're in the right place. So just stay tuned. So before we get started on the install, let's go ahead and see exactly what comes in the box.
Oh, what's in the box?
I'm very happy to say that MAPerformance provided lots of foam padding to protect our downpipe on its journey to my garage. You can see they've even added a little extra foam around the cat itself, so everything arrived nice and safe. So I chose MAPerformance on my own. I'm not sponsored by these guys, but they have super high quality parts. You can see right here on the inside seam, it's been welded. Now I'm not sure if all the downpipes available out there, and there's quite a few, have the inside seam welded where the turbo connects up. You can see the outside seam's got a nice weld, but I'm not sure if everyone has an inside welded seam as well. And I've definitely would recommend a welded inner seam. I've had problems with pipes in the past with cracking on the seams because there's no inner seam weld. And you can see now this seam right here is not welded. This is where the downpipe connects to the front pipe. You don't need a welded inner seam right here because the gas is flowing out, but you've got a lot of pressure right here where the seam connects to the turbo, and you just really it's a better way to go to have an inner welded seam as well as obviously the outer seams all being welded. I'm not sure if every downpipe has this or not, but MAPerformance does. That's one of the reasons I'm happy I got this one. Look how thick that flange is. That's incredible that these flanges are really beefy. Also, these welds right here are awesome. As you can see, these are really nice TIG welds right here. So this is overall high quality pipe. So you can see it also comes with a bag of hardware for your downpipe, and that's great. We'll be utilizing all these parts later on. We'll go into that more detail later, but I also want to recommend that you purchase a new gasket for the turbo to downpipe connection here. You definitely don't want to be reusing your old gasket. If anytime you pull your downpipe off, you want to replace the gasket. I've seen some people reuse this gasket. It's not advised. I've got 100,000 miles on my car, and I would definitely not recommend reusing a gasket with 100,000 or even 50,000 miles on it. So get a new gasket. It's available. It also comes with this extension here because we're going to be relocating the O2 sensor a little bit lower on the downpipe, and you're going to need this extension to get it to hook up correctly. And also it has a brace so you can reuse your heat shield, your factory heat shield. We'll be utilizing that, so that's nice that it comes with this little bracket to relocate your heat shield onto your new downpipe. So as of 2024, this catted downpipe with a new turbo gasket goes for about $690, which is pretty pricey, but you can see it's high quality. Before we get started, let's go ahead and get your car placed on jack stands or ramps like I have mine placed on right here, so we can access underneath the car to get to the downpipe to front pipe connection. We'll be removing a couple panels here, so do that before we get started on anything else. MAPerformance has downloadable instructions on their website on how to install this downpipe. Definitely, I recommend you download those and follow along. I'm going to show you on the video, of course, but it's nice to have those instructions. First, we're going to remove this metal pan that you would normally remove to change your oil, and this plastic piece that's attached right next to it here, this little thin plastic piece in the front area. It's only held on by some Phillips screws and some plastic push pins, so this is really easy to remove both of these two panels, and then that will give us clear access to the factory catted downpipe that we're going to be removing. We're going to be starting from underneath where the front pipe's bolted up. So Boom! I've removed those two. You can do that on your own. And now what you're looking at is that bulbous thing right there is the bottom of the downpipe and where it's attached to the front pipe. And you can see I've got a bit of rust here. It's not bad, but it's definitely got some rust. And I just want to show you a couple braces that's attached to this. There's one right here that's attached to the oil pan and one that's attached to the transmission, one on both sides. We'll be removing those after we break the bolts loose from the front pipe to the downpipe. Now at this point you're going to need to coat this all down with some type of liquid wrench or PB blaster. I like PB blaster. You're going to want to coat these and let it soak for a few hours. I would say at least an hour minimum, just depending on where you're coming from. Some places are going to have more rust forming on your downpipe to cat than others. I'm in the southeast. It's not that bad. I let mine soak for probably 2-3 hours. You can see it looks a lot better now that I've sprayed it down and let it soak in. But we're going to break these 3 nuts off of the front pipe to downpipe first. Okay, we'll start the whole thing off with removing the 3 14mm nuts that are attaching the front pipe to the downpipe, and we're going to need a breaker bar, of course, and 14mm socket. And I was able to break this lower one loose with just the breaker bar itself. It really depends on how many miles you've got on your car. We're talking about 30 foot-pounds of torque plus rust on top of that. So, and depending on the mileage, it could be more or less torque involved for you. I had to end up getting a extension for the upper 2 bolts because it was just too hard to break them loose with just the breaker bar only. All right, now that the 14mm nuts are removed, we can go ahead and attack these 4 14mm bolts that are holding the bracing to the front pipe downpipe connection loose. You can see I'm working on the oil pan side of the bracing right here, and then I'm going to swap over to the transmission side right here. Now these bolts have a lot less torque. They're just really for bracing only. There's nowhere near 30 foot-pounds holding these on. You can see I'm actually using a mountain wrench here because it's so easy to break these loose. So that's the good news. We got the hard part over first, and now we're just going to remove these 4 bolts. These braces come off pretty easily. Just remember which side each brace goes on and the orientation that they were when they were in place, so you don't get confused, and just keep the 2 bolts separate. That's what I did, at least. I kept the 2 bolts for each brace separate from each other, so when I reattach them, they go back to where they came from. Now let's move to the top of the engine bay for a little bit. We have a Cobra cold air intake here, but don't worry if you have a regular intake. I'm going to briefly go over that as well. But you're in luck if you have a Cobra cold air intake, because all we have to do is remove this silicone hose right here and the 2 metal clamps attaching this hose to the intake, and we have enough room to access the bolts to the top of the turbo. Now if you're running stock like this configuration right here, we're going to do essentially the same thing. We're going to remove this corrugated tube right here by releasing these 2 metal bands, which is relatively easy to do, just like the Cobra cold air intake tube, but you're probably going to need to remove the top of the air box as well, because it's just so bulky. I just see this being in the way. I can't say 100% positive because mine's already removed, but I could see this bulky thing getting in the way of your extensions. We're going to need to get some long extensions in here to get to those bolts. So it's pretty easy, just 4 or 5 bolts to remove this top part. I have a video on how to do this, and I'll link it below in case you have this configuration. It'll make it real simple for you to remove the top of this intake box. Okay, now it's time to remove the heat shield from the downpipe. You can see I have a 12mm mountain wrench right here, and there's a bolt right on top. It's super easy to get to, especially if you have these mountain wrenches. I'll link those below, but it wasn't held on that tight. I just cracked it loose, and then I was able to just hand spin this thing right out. So that's the good news. It's not bad at all, and it just comes right out by hand. Now there's 2 more bolts that we need to remove, and they're right down close to the inside of the radiator / fan area right in here. Super easy to spot and see, and I was able to make quick work of those with the mountain wrench. Once again, I just got my mountain wrench on the bolt, cracked it loose, and I was able to hand spin these out. Hopefully yours will be able to hand spin out, but if not, you'll just have to use the wrench to get them out. But they weren't really stuck on there. I thought there might be some rust or corrosion. Nope, they just came right out, so that was nice. So once those 3 bolts are removed, the heat shields just kind of dangle in there. Okay, now that the bolts are removed from the heat shield, we can slide the heat shield off the top of the downpipe and slide it down towards the bottom of the engine bay here. That's the plan, at least. I thought I might be able to pull it out from the top at first, but no, it's a lot easier, trust me, to go from the bottom. So just kind of slide it down between the fan and the downpipe and get it close to the bottom. And then once you get underneath, it's very pliable. You kind of bend it a little bit and you can just pull it on out past the downpipe from underneath. It's a lot easier that way. I didn't show that part because it's pretty simple. Okay, before we break the 2 nuts and 2 bolts off the turbo to downpipe connection, I wanted to show you exactly where they're located to the best of my ability here with this camera. There's a bolt right here. We'll start on the outside edge. This is the left hand side. You can see that bolt clearly right there, that 14 mil bolt, and then below it is a 14 mil nut. And it's the same thing on the other side, except it's swapped. There's a 14 mil nut right there. See that? And then below it down in there is a 14 mil bolt. So you can see they're swapped on both sides. And yes, they definitely need to be coated heavily with liquid wrench or PB Blaster or some type of penetrating oil. And that needs to sit for quite a long time. I would recommend you let it soak overnight if possible. That would be your best bet. People have definitely broken off the studs here. That's one of the main problems, is breaking the studs. We're going to disconnect the O2 sensor. It's the one on the right, not the left, but the one on the right. And that's easy to disconnect. And then there's a little metal bracket that's attached to right there. And we'll use a flathead screwdriver to break that loose. But that's the plan of attack here. The O2 sensor and then the bolts and the nuts attaching the turbo to downpipe. We're going to start off with removing the O2 sensor, and really easy to remove this tab by pushing down right here and then pulling back. It releases really easy, no problem at all. It's straightforward. But this little gray piece right down here, that was definitely pretty tricky, a little challenging. It actually clicks into a little metal heat shield down here, and we're probably going to remove that heat shield later on. I'm going to show you how to do that later, but it clicks right in there, and you have to take a flathead screwdriver and depress that little tab on top right there. So I'm going to kind of try to show you how it works, but you take a flathead screwdriver and you're going to push down on this piece right here. Let me get it for you. There we go. Right here, that little tab that's right on top, right there. Push down on that, and then you can pull forward, and it should come out of this little metal heat shield right here. It was a little tricky, but it wasn't that bad. You're not going to need needle pliers, though. Just a flathead screwdriver is all it took to get this out. Okay, now that it's been removed, and we can just tuck it down into the engine bay, because we're going to leave this thing attached to the downpipe, and we're just going to pull the downpipe out with the O2 sensor in it, and we'll remove that later. Okay, I'm going to start off by breaking the upper bolt and upper nut loose on the turbo to downpipe connection. I'm using a breaker bar here, a 10-inch extension with a 14 millimeter extended socket here. You can kind of use what you have available, but this was the easiest for me, and that gave me some good leverage here, and I was able to break the bolt that's on the left side loose pretty easily. It wasn't much of a struggle at all, and it was actually able to spin out. Once I got it loosened up, I was able to spin this guy out. So that was the good news. It wasn't totally crusted in there or baked in there, and I was able to remove it fairly easy. Now, the directions say if you're having trouble with the nut, which is we're going to be removing next, that if it's starting to stick or you think you're going to break the stud, that you can use an impact gun, and people have had more success with a stuck nut using an impact gun. Now, luckily, I did not have that issue on this side. I was able to get this extension in there pretty easily, and it did do some squeaking and squawking a little bit. It was a little bit rough to break loose at first, and it was kind of hanging in there, and then it broke loose. So mine spun off. It definitely started off kind of rough and then loosened up. But they're saying if you use an impact gun, if you can't get yours to break loose very easily, that it might save that stud. Last thing you want to do is snap that stud, because then you'll have to tap it and remove it. And of course, that's going to be a big hassle. So make sure you coat the heck out of these two bolts and studs on top with some PB Blast or liquid wrench or whatever you have available, because you don't want to snap that stud off. Okay, I use the exact same extension and breaker bar and socket for the lower bolt and nut. The one on the outside was relatively easy, and the last one that was on the inside, I believe that was actually it was a bolt. Yeah, it's the bolt. I had to go under the intercooler piping, as you can see right there, and this one was the hardest one to remove. So I gave it a couple tugs. It wasn't feeling too good, so I had to break out my floor jack handle to give me some more leverage, because it was just really tight in there. But once I did get my leverage from the floor jack handle, then I was able to break it loose. It was a little sticky, but it broke loose. Just take it easy. You definitely don't want to snap that bolt off either. But it did come loose. It was just a little harder than the rest. Okay, now before we can remove the front pipe from the downpipe, there's a rubber hanger down here right where my hand is. You can't miss it. Spray it down with 303 aerospace protectant or Armor All. I like to use that versus a lubricant like WD-40 or anything like that, because oil-based lubricants break down rubber really rapidly, and the Armor All or 303 is not going to hurt it. And I was able to remove that pretty easily. Once you get that hanger removed from the front pipe, it makes it a lot easier to disconnect the front pipe from the downpipe. You can see I kind of finagled with it for a second, and it came loose. It wasn't too bad. I had to kind of push on it for a minute and jiggle it, and it came loose. So now we're ready to pull the downpipe out of the engine bay. Okay, now we're ready to remove the downpipe through the bottom here, and basically you're going to use one hand to kind of jiggle it off the studs up top, and once you get it off the two studs up top, it's going to kind of be floating free in the engine bay there, and then you're going to use one hand to kind of push the front pipe aside as you lower the downpipe. So you can see I'm using the two-handed technique, pushing the front pipe aside and slowly manipulating the downpipe and sliding out real easy. Don't get too aggressive here. You don't want to damage the intercooling piping, which is right there. You can see I'm just, that heat shield's right up against the intercooler piping. You want to be real gentle with this. Just take your time. It will definitely come out. You can see it really wasn't that bad at all. And you just want to go nice and slow. You don't want to snag anything and tear up the inside of your engine bay trying to get it out. Just go real slow and easy. You can see it came out relatively easy here. Make sure you're wearing eye protection too. I didn't mention that. You don't want anything getting in your eyes. Okay, now it's time to take the new downpipe, and we're going to be seating the 3 studs that connect to the front pipe. I just test fitted each one. They fit in there pretty easy. I just spun them in by hand. You don't really need a wrench or anything to screw these in. Hopefully yours will just screw right in for you, just like mine did. Now I'm going to try something that's totally optional for you, because it doesn't mention this in the directions, but I'm going to use a little red Loctite to make sure that these 3 studs are going to kind of stay put once I place them into the flange here. So this is completely optional. You definitely don't have to do this. This is just me, but I just put just a little bit of red Loctite on the shorter end of the stud. The shorter end of the stud will be the side that gets screwed into the flange, and the longer end will be the part that goes to the front pipe. So just a little dab will do you, and I'm only doing that just to make sure that nothing vibrates loose. You don't have to do this. like I talked about earlier, is optional. But the preferable method to place these studs into the flange is by hand, and just hand tighten these in. They should go into there relatively easy. And now if it gets stuck or hung up halfway, I'll show you a little technique, but you do need to be careful because if you use a nut to help seat the stud, like I'm going to do with this third stud because it got hung up about halfway, most likely because of the Loctite, I'm not sure why, but you can take a nut, but you do need to place a washer on first. I didn't do that here. Make sure you place a washer on to the stud first, then place the nut on, and then you can use a wrench and keep tightening the nut till it comes up against the hub, and then it'll completely seat the stud at that point. But if you don't use a washer, there's a potential that the nut will get locked onto the stud, and then when you go to remove the bolt of the nut, they'll pull the whole stud back out again. Luckily that didn't happen here, but it's happened to me before, so be careful. Make sure you use a washer if you use this technique. Hopefully you won't have to, and everything will seat by normally by hand, but I was able to get this nut off easily and everything's seated now. Okay, now we're going to remove the O2 sensor from the OEM downpipe, and look how giant that catalytic converter is. We're going to have a lot better flow with this new downpipe. It's going to be awesome. It was really easy to remove the O2 sensor. I used one of these specialty sockets. You don't have to have one of these. Now that the downpipe is out of the engine bay, you can use any type of wrench to get this out, like a crescent wrench or open-end wrench to get it out. You don't have to have a specialty socket, and this thing came right out. I cleaned the tip up with some rubbing alcohol just to make sure that it was in good condition and it looks good. We won't be reinserting it into the downpipe though until after we get the downpipe installed into the engine bay. It'll just be a lot easier and less things to get in the way if we install this first. It'll be going right into the bung right here. Piece of cake. It's easy to do after this pipe's installed. But basically, we'll be placing this in the engine bay on the two studs that are connected to the turbo. Remember, there's two studs in there. And then we'll be placing this brace onto the two studs and around this downpipe. And I just want to show you the orientation. This is what it'll look like once it's placed in the engine bay correctly. And then that'll allow us to take the top of the OEM heat shield and bolt it back on top of this downpipe here. So that's what it'll look like in the engine bay once we get it all mounted up. The only difference will be that there'll be 2 points of attachment for the OEM heat shield to the brace versus the previous 3 bolts. So here and here, and we won't be utilizing all 3 of these holes anymore, but it's quite stable with just 2 points of attachment. Now at this time we also want to go ahead and plug in the O2 harness extension, and basically it just plugs right into the OEM sensor relay, and it gives us enough slack to where we're able to plug it back into where it came from and mount it down here towards the bottom of the downpipe, so we'll have enough slack. So go ahead and put that together as well. All right, now it's time to place in our new high flow catted downpipe into the engine bay, and needless to say, it's much smaller, slimmer, and it's going to be twice as easy as getting the OEM giant catted downpipe out of the engine bay like we did earlier. This thing goes in super smooth, so that's not the issue. I think the only issue you might have is actually getting this thing to seat onto the 2 studs that come out of the turbo outlet. It's a little difficult by yourself from underneath the car to get that slide on from underneath, but it's doable. I did it. It'd be great if you had a helping hand up top to grab that pipe and slide it onto the 2 studs. Now what I didn't show was I already placed on the brand new turbo to downpipe gasket. Make sure you go ahead and place that on to the 2 studs before you do this part of the procedure. And then once you get your new catted downpipe onto the studs, you're ready to go ahead and bolt it up. Okay, now that we finally got our brand new downpipe installed, as well as our brand new turbo to downpipe gasket, we're ready, almost ready to bolt this thing down, and we do need to first place this little brace. Now remember, this brace is the brace that we're going to be sliding over the outside of the downpipe, and then that'll get bolted straight on to the outside of the downpipe, and that's the framework for our heat shield that we talked about earlier. So it's got 2 points of attachment. A little tricky part is just getting this in here, so kind of pay close attention to how I'm sliding it in. It wasn't too bad. It was a two-hander though. It took me a minute to get it in there, and once I finally got it in there, I was able to slide it over. Okay, let's talk about what's in the box one more time here.
What's in the box?
Okay, this time let's focus on the hardware. We're talking about the copper flange locking nuts. You're gonna get 4 of those. You only need 2 of these. They're gonna go on the downpipe studs. But I had an issue once. It's gonna be replacing this brass looking nut right here. Once I started to screw these onto the downpipe studs, they started to bind, and it really felt like it was going to strip the downpipe studs. So I pulled them back off, and I tried it on one of these removable studs, and sure enough, it got locked about this far onto the stud, and it was unusable at that point. So at this point, I decided, I don't like these locking copper nuts. I'm not saying they're not going to work. I'm just saying I didn't like the way they felt when I was screwing them onto the studs. So I bought another whole hardware kit and decided to use the 3 flange nuts that go to the bottom of the downpipe on the top as well. So once I got new hardware in from MAPerformance, I went ahead and reused the 2 bolts and used the regular nuts on the turbo to downpipe studs, and I torqued everything down to 30 foot-pounds. The manufacturer suggests 25 to 33 foot-pounds. Okay, now that everything's torqued down up top, we're going to talk about the downpipe to front pipe connection. We're going to make sure we replace the 2 braces. This one goes to the transmission. This one's attached to the oil pan. We want to make sure that those 2 braces are placed on to the front pipe downpipe connection first, and we're going to tighten them down. I don't have torque specs for those, but make sure they're nice and tight before we go to torque the 3 bolts holding the downpipe to front pipe connection. We want to make sure those braces are nice and tight so nothing flexes when we put our 30 foot-pounds on these nuts here. If you're wondering why those studs are different colors, remember I talked about earlier where I was experimenting with those copper flange locking nuts, and I ended up replacing those studs with aftermarket parts. So now that we've got everything tightened up with the braces, we can go ahead and use our torque wrench to torque these 3 nuts down to 30 foot-pounds. Remember, it's between 25 and 33. I chose 30 foot-pounds. I didn't have any issues with this, and everything went on perfect. Okay, let's talk about heat shield installation. You want to thread this lower bolt right here in first into the bracket loosely. Then we're gonna come up top and get this bolt threaded into the bracket secondary, and then once you get them both placed correctly, you can go ahead and tighten it down. There's only one thing hampering you, is this little piece right here, which is kind of hard to see. This little heat shield, it's a tiny piece of the heat shield that the O2 sensor was set to earlier. See it right here? I'm going to flex it a little bit. It's kind of hard to make out, but you can see it where it's making contact with the heat shield that's on top of the downpipe. See it right there? You do need to bend this up. You don't want to take it off completely because you need it, but I grabbed something with a hook. You can see I've got this little hook right here, and I just slipped it underneath this little tiny heat shield and just pulled straight up and bent it up enough to where I could get better access to slide my downpipe heat shield on. It doesn't take a lot of manipulation. It's pretty thin metal, so it's not going to be real hard. Use your fingers, use a tool, whatever you have available, but just bend it up enough so that you can get the heat shield installed on top of the downpipe. Okay, to finish up the project, we're going to need to plug the O2 sensor back into its original coupling, which is right here. So you're going to plug it in and then drop it down in the engine bay. And when I mean drop it, I mean lower it nice and easy, because you don't want to bang the O2 sensor up in the engine bay in there, but just let it dangle down in there. And then you can come down from underneath, and we're going to route it right by the transmission area right here where the slave cylinder is joined to the transmission. You can run it right here. I found a good spot. It tucks in there nicely and everything stays secure. You can zip tie it if you want. When you go to screw the O2 sensor in, remember, kind of back it up the opposite direction so that once you screw the O2 sensor into the downpipe, that it straightens itself out. So you'll have to do a few revolutions in the reverse order, then screw it into the downpipe and tighten it up. You can use an open-end wrench or your specialty socket if you have one. I happen to have a specialty socket, so I just tighten it up nice and tight. I don't have any torque specs for you, but it went in there super easy, and there's lots of room to get your wrench in here, as you can see for yourself. We've got tons of room to get this thing tightened up. So everything is now complete with the downpipe.
Cold start.
So as you can hear, pairing this downpipe with an aftermarket exhaust really has a nice deep throaty tone to it. I'm very pleased with the sound. So next up, let's take it for a little test drive. Okay, now we're going to do a little low speed cruise inside the cabin with the windows down. I just want you to hear what it sounded like with the downpipe installed. It's a little bit louder for sure, but not too bad at all at low speed.
This is without sport mode on. Here's the sport mode on, so.
One thing is for sure, the exhaust note is definitely louder now, but I don't think it's over the top. It's sounding pretty good to me. Just a tiny bit of drone on the freeway. So you'll have to be the judge of that yourself by listening to the sound clips. And also you will definitely have to have a tune to run this downpipe. You'll be throwing codes if you don't have either K-Tuner, Hondata, or a custom tune to turn off the secondary O2 sensor. So make sure you have a tune available before you install this pipe. As far as performance goes, hands down, one of the best installs I've done on this car so far. You'll be amazed once you hit higher boost levels, how fast this thing is. It definitely woke the car up. You will not be disappointed with this thing. So if this video helped you out, don't forget to give me a big old fat thumbs up. And until next time, you know what to do. Just keep on repairing.